I was lying in that hospital bed, still groggy from the anesthesia, when I heard my husband of 32 years whispering into his phone in the hallway. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Once the house transfers and the life insurance processes, we'll have everything we need to start fresh. She'll never know what hit her." The woman's voice on the other end was breathy and excited, talking about redecorating our new home and planning their future with my money, my property, my life's work, while I was supposedly dying in surgery. You know, there's something particularly cruel about discovering your husband's betrayal while you're at your most vulnerable, tubes still connected to your body, unable to even sit up properly. But maybe that's exactly when you need to discover it, when you're stripped down to nothing but your own strength and forced to see the truth without any comfortable illusions left to hide behind. I should probably start from the beginning, though that feels like describing a completely different life now, one where I was still living in the comfortable fiction that the man I'd loved since I was 23 actually loved me back. We met in college, Donald and I, both studying business, both from middle-class families in Ohio where people believed in hard work and keeping your word. He was charming in that steady, reliable way that made my father approve and my mother sigh with relief. "He'll take care of you, Margaret," she used to say, and I suppose in some ways he did, at least in the beginning. What nobody talks about when you're young and planning your life is how marriage can become this slow, steady erosion of yourself if you're not careful. It doesn't happen all at once. That would be too obvious, too easy to fight against. Instead, it's like water wearing away stone, so gradual you don't notice until one day you look up and realize you've been carved into someone completely different from who you started as. For 32 years, I accommodated, adjusted, and adapted, always telling myself that's what love looked like, what partnership meant. The irony wasn't lost on me that Donald had built his entire comfortable life on the foundation of my inheritance, my family's property, and my business acumen, while somehow convincing both of us that he was the provider, the decision-maker, the head of our household. My grandmother had left me the family house when I was 25, a beautiful Victorian in the historic district that was already worth quite a bit then and had appreciated enormously over the decades. But Donald had this way of talking about our house and our investments that made even me forget sometimes that the deed had only my name on it, that the property taxes came out of my personal account, that I'd been the one to fund the renovations and improvements over the years. I'd also started a small consulting business in my 30s that had grown into something quite substantial by the time I hit 50. Nothing flashy, just helping small businesses organize their operations and improve their efficiency, but it had been steady and profitable for decades. Donald liked to joke at dinner parties about his little entrepreneur wife, in a tone that somehow made my success sound like a charming hobby rather than a legitimate business that had probably contributed more to our household income than his middle management position at the insurance company. But the real foundation of our financial security, the thing Donald either forgot about or chose to ignore, was the trust fund my grandfather had established for me before he died. It wasn't enormous by some standards, but it was substantial enough that the interest alone could support a comfortable lifestyle. More importantly, it was structured in a way that protected it from any claims by spouses in the event of divorce or death. Grandfather had been a careful man who'd seen too many family fortunes disappear through poor marriages and bad decisions. The principal could only be accessed by me and only me, and would pass to any children I had, or to charity if I died without issue. We'd never had children, Donald and I. We'd tried for a few years in our 20s, then gotten caught up in careers and travel, and somehow the trying had stopped, and the subject had become one of those things married couples stopped talking about. I'd made peace with it mostly, though I sometimes wondered if things would have been different if we'd had a family to bind us together, some shared project that would have required us to truly know and depend on each other. As it was, we'd settled into one of those marriages that looks perfectly functional from the outside but feels increasingly hollow from within. We had our routines, our shared social circle, our comfortable house, and regular vacations. Donald came home every evening at 6:15. We ate dinner while watching the news. We went to bed at reasonable hours and got up to do it all again. It was pleasant enough, I suppose, if you didn't look too closely at the growing distance between us, the way conversations had become purely logistical, the way intimacy had faded so gradually I couldn't pinpoint when it had disappeared entirely. I should have seen the signs earlier, but I think I'd become so accustomed to the loneliness that I'd stopped recognizing it as a problem to be solved rather than just a condition to be endured. Donald started working later, taking more business trips, being generally less present even when he was physically in the house. He'd always been somewhat self-centered, that hadn't changed, but there was a new distraction, a sense that his attention was focused elsewhere in a way it hadn't been before. The surgery that changed everything was supposed to be routine, a gallbladder removal, laparoscopic outpatient procedure that had somehow become complicated when they discovered more adhesions than expected. What should have been a few hours, under anesthesia, turned into a 6-hour surgery and a 3-day hospital stay. Donald had seemed appropriately concerned, visiting regularly, bringing flowers and magazines, playing the part of the devoted husband for the nurses and doctors. But looking back, I realized he'd been making phone calls during those visits, stepping out into the hallway frequently, always with some excuse about needing to handle work matters or call his sister. I'd been too medicated and tired to pay much attention, grateful for the quiet time to rest and recover. It never occurred to me that my husband was using my medical crisis as cover for planning my replacement. The conversation I overheard that third evening wasn't the first one he'd had with her. That much became clear as I lay there listening, pretending to be asleep. They talked with the comfortable intimacy of people who'd been planning this for a while, discussing details about transferring assets, changing beneficiaries, even selling some of my personal jewelry that had been in my family for generations. The woman, Diane, he called her, had apparently already been through the house deciding which furniture she wanted to keep and which pieces would need to go to make room for her own things. The bedroom set is gorgeous, she was saying, but I'll want to get new linens, obviously, something that feels like ours, not hers. And that dining room table is perfect for entertaining. I can already picture hosting dinner parties there. Your wife always kept the house so stuffy and formal, but I'll make it feel warm and welcoming. Your wife, not Margaret, not even that woman. Just your wife, as if I were already dead and buried, a minor inconvenience to be disposed of before they could move on with their real lives. The casual cruelty of it was almost more shocking than the betrayal itself. This wasn't some passionate affair that had gotten out of hand. This was a calculated replacement operation, and I was apparently the only one who hadn't gotten the memo that my life was being auctioned off. We'll need to be careful about the timing, Donald was saying. The lawyers can handle most of the paperwork, but we don't want to raise any suspicions before everything's properly transferred. Once the life insurance claim is processed and the house is in your name, we can be more open about everything. Life insurance claim, house in her name. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Not quite anger yet, but something harder and more focused. They weren't just planning to leave me. They were planning for me to be dead. And not just metaphorically dead to them, but actually physically dead, with Donald as the grieving widower who'd found comfort in the arms of a caring woman during his time of loss. The thing about being systematically underestimated for decades is that people forget you have a mind of your own, forget that you've been paying attention even when you seem to be passively going, along with their plans. Donald had gotten so comfortable with my accommodating nature that he'd apparently assumed I would accommodate being murdered and replaced without complaint. It was, I had to admit, the most efficient solution from his perspective. No messy divorce, no division of assets, no awkward explanations to friends and family. Just a tragic loss followed by a heartwarming love story about finding happiness again. But what Donald had forgotten, or perhaps never really understood, was that being accommodating isn't the same thing as being powerless. For 32 years, I'd chosen to defer to his preferences, to let him feel like the decision-maker, to maintain the fiction that he was the strong one in our marriage. That had been a choice, a gift I'd given freely because I'd believed it made him happy and our marriage smoother. It had never been a reflection of my actual capabilities or resources. As I lay there listening to them plan my demise and their future, I found myself thinking about my grandmother, who'd lived through the Depression and 2 wars, and had taught me that a smart woman always keeps her own counsel and her own resources. Never let a man know everything you're capable of, Margaret, she used to say. Keep something in reserve for when you really need it. At the time, I thought she was being overly dramatic, a product of her generation's different expectations about marriage. Now, I realized she'd been giving me survival instructions. The next morning, Donald came in with his usual concerned husband expression, asking how I was feeling, whether I needed anything, when the doctors thought I might be ready to go home. He'd brought coffee from my favorite shop and a newspaper, small gestures that might have seemed thoughtful if I hadn't heard him discussing my death and property division 12 hours earlier. Watching him perform caring husband while mentally spending my money was almost fascinating in its audacity. I've been thinking, Mistress, he said, settling into the visitor's chair with that earnest expression he used when he wanted to seem particularly trustworthy. Maybe we should review our wills and insurance policies. This whole experience has reminded me how unpredictable life can be. We want to make sure everything's in order, just in case. Just in case. As if my potential death was some abstract possibility he was prudently preparing for, rather than an outcome he was actively hoping for and possibly planning to accelerate. I made appropriate agreeable noises, telling him that sounded like a good idea, that we should definitely make sure our affairs were in order. Playing along felt surreal, but I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out exactly how deep this betrayal went and what my options were. I was thinking we might want to update the beneficiaries on the house and investment accounts too, he continued, watching my face carefully. Maybe simplify things so everything flows more smoothly to the survivor. Less complications for whoever's left behind. The survivor. He was being so careful with his language, so thoughtful about not saying anything directly incriminating, but the message was clear enough. He wanted me to sign documents that would make it easier for him to inherit everything when I died, and he wanted me to do it while I was still weak and medicated and presumably not thinking clearly. It was actually quite clever in a sociopathic kind of way. That sounds reasonable, Machiavellian, I told him, keeping my voice appropriately tired and trusting. Why don't you have your lawyer friend draft something up and we can review it when I'm feeling a bit stronger? His relief was almost palpable. Perfect. I'll call Tom this afternoon. He's always said we should have a more comprehensive estate plan anyway. Tom Morrison, Donald's drinking buddy from college who'd gone into estate law and had been after our business for years. I'd always preferred our family attorney, Helen Chen, who was more thorough and less inclined to take shortcuts. Now I understood why Donald was suddenly interested in switching lawyers. Over the next few days, as I recovered at home, I started paying attention to things I'd been unconsciously ignoring for months. Donald's schedule had become much more erratic, with evening meetings and weekend work sessions that hadn't existed before. His phone, which used to sit casually on kitchen counters and bedroom dressers, was now constantly in his possession, face down, password protected. He'd developed a habit of taking calls in the garage or out in the backyard, always with some explanation about needing better reception or not wanting to disturb me. More telling were the small changes around the house. My grandmother's china had been moved from the dining room to a high shelf in the basement, supposedly to protect it from earthquake damage. Several pieces of my mother's jewelry had disappeared from my jewelry box, though when I asked about them, Donald suggested I might have moved them myself and forgotten. Family photographs had been gradually disappearing from the main living areas, replaced with more generic artwork or simply empty spaces. It was like watching someone methodically erase my presence from my own home, preparing the space for a new occupant while I was still living in it. The violation was so complete, so systematic, that I almost had to admire the thoroughness of it. Donald wasn't just planning to replace me, he was already doing it, one small change at a time, conditioning himself and the house for my absence. The proposed will changes arrived within a week, delivered by Tom Morrison himself rather than sent through the mail. Tom had always been an overly familiar man, the kind who called me sweetheart, and patted my shoulder condescendingly when we met at social functions. He presented the documents with the kind of forced joviality that made it clear he thought he was dealing with a simple-minded woman who wouldn't read the fine print. Donald's been smart to think about this now, he said, spreading the papers across our kitchen table like he was doing us an enormous favor. These documents will make everything much simpler when the time comes. No probate, no complications, just a clean transfer of assets to the surviving spouse. What the documents actually did was transfer ownership of the house immediately to joint tenancy with right of survivorship, remove my separate property protections on the investment accounts, and make Donald the sole beneficiary of my life insurance policy. In return, I would become the beneficiary of Donald's much smaller insurance policy and his pension, which would barely cover a year's worth of property taxes on the house. It was a spectacularly one-sided arrangement disguised as mutual estate planning. This looks quite comprehensive, Bixby, I said, taking my time to read through each page while Tom fidgeted and Donald tried to look patient. I'll want to review it with my own attorney before signing, of course. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Tom's jovial expression became strained. Oh, that's really not necessary, Margaret. These are standard documents, and Donald and I have already reviewed everything thoroughly. Having another lawyer involved will just create delays and unnecessary complications. An expense, Donald added quickly. Helen charges twice what Tom does, and this is pretty straightforward stuff. But I was already reaching for my phone. Helen, it's Cynthia Morrison. I have some estate planning documents I'd like you to review. Yes, I know Donald and I usually handle things together, but I'd like my own independent advice on this. Tomorrow afternoon would be perfect. The silence after I hung up was deafening. Tom was gathering up his papers with barely concealed irritation, muttering about how modern women didn't trust their husbands anymore and how complicated simple matters had become. Donald was doing that thing where he tried to look supportive while clearly being furious, an expression I'd seen many times over the years when I'd inadvertently challenged his authority in front of others. "I don't understand why you need to involve Helen," he said after Tom left. "This is supposed to be about us planning our future together, not about you going behind my back to lawyers." Behind my back. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. But I just smiled and said something about wanting to be thorough, about making sure I understood everything before making such important decisions. Let him think I was being overly cautious rather than suspicious. Let him believe he still had control of the situation. Helen Chen had been my family's attorney for 15 years, handling everything from my grandmother's estate to my business contracts. She was a small, precise woman in her 60s who had the useful quality of being consistently underestimated by men like Donald and Tom. They saw a diminutive Asian woman and assumed she was either decorative or deferential. They never noticed the steel in her eyes or the way she remembered every detail of every conversation she'd ever had. "These documents are interesting," she said, after reviewing everything the next afternoon in her downtown office. "Particularly interesting given your existing estate structure. Has Donald forgotten about your trust fund?" That was the question I'd been waiting for someone to ask. "I don't think he's forgotten exactly. I think he's hoping I have." Helen raised an eyebrow. "The trust your grandfather established is quite clear. The principal can only be accessed by you, and it reverts to charity upon your death unless you have children. No spouse has any claim to it under any circumstances. These documents Donald wants you to sign wouldn't change that, but they would give him everything else you own. Including the house. Including the house, which is currently titled solely in your name and represents a substantial portion of your net worth. Margaret, I have to ask, are you and Donald having marital difficulties?" I'd never said the words out loud before, but sitting in Helen's office with the evidence spread out in front of us, the truth felt inevitable. "I think my husband is planning to kill me." Helen set down her pen very carefully. "That's a serious accusation. I know how it sounds, but I overheard him making plans with another woman, discussing life insurance payouts and transferring assets after my death. He's been moving my personal belongings out of the house, changing our social patterns, even switching lawyers to someone more likely to overlook irregularities. And now he wants me to sign documents that would make him the sole beneficiary of almost everything I own. Documents that need to be executed while I'm still recovering from surgery and potentially not thinking clearly. Have you considered that he might be planning to divorce you rather than the alternative? Divorce would mean splitting assets, explaining the end of a 32-year marriage to family and friends, dealing with the social and financial complications of starting over at 58. This way, he gets everything, plus sympathy as the grieving widower who's found love again after tragedy. Helen was quiet for a long moment, thinking, "What do you want to do?" That was the question I'd been asking myself for days. What did I want? Justice, certainly. Protection, obviously. But beyond that, I realized I wanted something I hadn't had in years. I wanted my life back. Not the life I'd been living as Donald's accommodating wife, but the life I might have had if I'd never forgotten who I was underneath all that accommodation. "I want to disappear," I said. "Legally, financially, completely. I want Donald to think he's succeeded in getting everything he wanted, right up until the moment he discovers he's gotten nothing at all." Helen smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Now that sounds like a plan worth developing. Over the next several weeks, while Donald thought I was recovering from surgery and considering his estate planning proposals, Helen and I were actually constructing an elaborate legal maze designed to protect my assets and give me maximum flexibility for whatever came next. The beauty of having been financially independent before my marriage was that untangling myself from it was largely a matter of reversing decisions I'd made voluntarily over the years. The house, which had always been titled in my name alone, would be transferred into a revocable trust with me as the sole trustee and beneficiary. Donald, who had been living there as my guest for 32 years, would have no legal claim to it in the event of my death or our separation. My business assets, investment accounts, and personal property would be similarly protected through a series of legal structures that would make them completely inaccessible to Donald regardless of what happened to me. More importantly, Helen introduced me to a colleague who specialized in what she delicately called personal security matters. James Rodriguez was a former police detective who now worked as a private investigator, helping people document evidence of fraud, adultery, and domestic threats. He was exactly the kind of man Donald would dismiss as irrelevant. Quiet, methodical, unassuming, and therefore exactly the kind of man who would be able to gather evidence without being noticed. Your husband's been sloppy, Mom, James told me after a week of surveillance. He's not trying very hard to hide the relationship, just keeping it away from your immediate social circle. The woman is Diane Fletcher, 42, divorced, works as a marketing coordinator at a downtown firm. They've been seeing each other for about 8 months, and she's apparently been quite open with friends about planning to marry him once he's free. Free. Such a euphemistic way to describe my planned death. She's also been shopping for engagement rings and looking at wedding venues, James continued. I have photographs of them together at several locations, including some interesting conversations about timeline and logistics. Would you like me to continue monitoring their communications? What I'd really like, I said, is for you to help me become someone else for a while. James looked intrigued. How completely someone else? Completely enough that if something happens to Cynthia Morrison, she can disappear entirely and reappear somewhere else as someone new. That's more complicated, but not impossible. How much time do we have? I thought about Donald's increasing impatience with my delays in signing his estate documents, about the way he'd been subtly pressuring me to schedule another medical procedure to address some lingering digestive issues from the surgery. Not much. Maybe a few weeks. While James worked on creating my exit strategy, I focused on playing the role Donald expected me to play. I scheduled the follow-up medical procedure he'd been suggesting, signed up for what appeared to be routine medical tests, even started making noises about being ready to finalize the estate planning documents. I wanted him to feel confident that his plan was proceeding smoothly, that I suspected nothing and was cooperating fully with my own destruction. The follow-up procedure was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early October. It was supposed to be minor, outpatient surgery to address some scar tissue from the previous operation. Donald was solicitous and concerned, offering to take the day off work to drive me to the hospital and wait during the procedure. For a man planning to murder his wife, he was remarkably attentive to her medical care. What Donald didn't know was that I wasn't actually having surgery that Tuesday. Instead, I was meeting with James and Helen at a private medical facility an hour outside the city, where a doctor friend of Helen's was helping us create a very different kind of medical record. By the end of the day, Cynthia Morrison would have officially died from unexpected surgical complications. Her body would have been quietly cremated per her previously expressed wishes, and Donald would be free to begin his new life with Diane. The real Cynthia Morrison, meanwhile, would be beginning her own new life as Elizabeth Harper, a widow from Phoenix who had recently relocated to a charming coastal town in Northern California where she planned to start a small consulting business and enjoy her well-earned retirement. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Donald would get exactly what he'd been planning for: my death, my house, my life insurance payout, and freedom to marry Diane without any messy complications. The only difference would be that none of it would actually belong to him. That Tuesday morning, I kissed my husband goodbye for the last time, told him I'd see him when I woke up from surgery, and walked out of the house I'd lived in for 32 years. Donald was already on the phone before my car had pulled out of the driveway, probably calling Diane to tell her that everything was proceeding according to plan. By noon, Cynthia Morrison was officially dead, and Elizabeth Harper was boarding a flight to San Francisco with nothing but a small suitcase and a very large bank account. Helen would handle the notification to Donald, the execution of my will, which left him the house and its contents but nothing else, and the discovery that the life insurance policy had lapsed due to non-payment, an oversight that would unfortunately prevent any payout to the surviving spouse. I'd been looking forward to that particular revelation. Donald had been so focused on gaining access to my assets that he'd never bothered to verify they were actually accessible. The house, which he thought he was inheriting, was mortgaged to nearly its full value, loans I'd taken out quietly over the past month and transferred to my trust account. The investment accounts he'd been counting on had been liquidated and moved offshore. Even my grandmother's china and my mother's jewelry had been quietly donated to charity, leaving him with nothing but empty rooms and empty promises. But the real masterpiece of the plan wouldn't be revealed until Donald tried to access what he thought were his inheritance. That's when he discovered that not only had he gained nothing from my death, but he'd actually lost everything he thought he already had. The house he'd been living in for 32 years had never been his, and with the mortgage I'd arranged, it would need to be sold immediately to cover the debt. His own bank accounts, which had been gradually drained through a series of legitimate-seeming transfers, would prove to be empty. Even his pension and insurance policy had been compromised through his association with Tom Morrison, who was about to have his own legal difficulties related to fraudulent estate planning practices. James had been very thorough in his investigation of Donald's financial situation. It turned out that my husband had been borrowing against his future inheritance for months, taking out loans and making investments based on the assumption that he'd soon have access to my assets. Without that inheritance, he was not only broke, but significantly in debt to some rather unforgiving creditors. Diane, meanwhile, would discover that the wealthy widower she'd been planning to marry was actually a financial disaster who'd lost everything through poor planning and worse luck. The fairy tale future they'd been planning would evaporate along with Donald's fictional fortune, leaving them both with nothing but each other's company and a growing pile of debt. It was, I had to admit, a more thorough destruction than anything I'd originally planned. Donald hadn't just lost his wife and gained nothing. He'd lost everything he'd previously had as well. The careful, methodical way he'd planned my replacement had been turned back on him with interest. From my new home overlooking the Pacific Ocean, I found myself surprisingly peaceful about the whole arrangement. Elizabeth Harper was proving to be a much more interesting person than Cynthia Morrison had been in her later years. She was more decisive, more independent, less concerned with maintaining harmony at the expense of her own happiness. She had her own business, her own social circle, her own routines that didn't revolve around accommodating anyone else's preferences. I'd kept James on retainer to monitor the situation back home, partly for security reasons, but mostly out of curiosity about how Donald and Diane were adjusting to their new circumstances. The reports were entertaining in a darkly satisfying way. Donald had apparently gone through the classic stages of grief, starting with denial that the inheritance he'd been counting on didn't exist, moving through anger at the lawyers and banks who couldn't magically produce money that had never been there, and settling into a kind of depressed acceptance of his situation. Diane had been less philosophical about the loss of her expected lifestyle upgrade. According to James's sources, she'd ended the relationship as soon as it became clear that Donald was financially ruined rather than financially liberated by his wife's death. She'd apparently told mutual friends that she couldn't be expected to take on someone else's debt problems, that she'd been looking for security and partnership, not a charity case who'd mismanaged his own affairs. The poetic justice of Donald being abandoned by someone who'd only valued him for his financial prospects wasn't lost on me. For 32 years, I'd loved him despite his flaws, supported him through career setbacks, accommodated his preferences even when they conflicted with my own. Diane had loved him only for what she thought he could provide, and when he couldn't provide it, she'd discarded him immediately. He'd traded a partner for a transaction, and when the transaction failed to materialize, he'd been left with nothing. Helen had called a few months after my death to update me on the legal aftermath. Donald had tried to contest my will, claiming that I'd been mentally incompetent when I'd made my final arrangements, and that he'd been entitled to a larger share of the estate as my surviving spouse. Unfortunately for him, the extensive medical and legal documentation we'd created showed clearly that I'd been mentally competent and had made careful, deliberate decisions about my assets. His challenge had been dismissed quickly, with the judge noting that surviving spouses were entitled to support from an estate, not to assets that had been explicitly protected from spousal claims. Tom Morrison, meanwhile, was facing disbarment proceedings related to his pattern of encouraging clients to sign disadvantageous estate planning documents without proper independent legal advice. It seemed that Donald and I hadn't been his only victims. He'd been systematically helping husbands convince wives to sign away their property rights for years. Helen had provided evidence of his practices to the State Bar Association, along with documentation of several other suspicious cases that deserved investigation. Donald's actually working as a sales clerk now, Helen told me during one of our periodic check-ins. Retail furniture, part-time hours. He's living in a studio apartment across town and taking the bus to work. Diane married an orthodontist from Vancouver and moved to Canada. Your house sold to a lovely young family who've restored the garden beautifully. The house. I found I missed it less than I'd expected. It had been full of memories, but most of the recent ones hadn't been particularly pleasant. The new house was smaller but brighter, with ocean views and a garden I'd planted myself. Elizabeth Harper's life was simpler than Cynthia Morrison's had been, but it was authentically her own, in a way that the previous life hadn't been for years. I'd started a new consulting business focusing on helping women over 50 transition into independent retirement planning. There was apparently a significant market for someone who understood the particular financial challenges facing women who'd spent decades accommodating other people's priorities. My first client had been a woman whose husband had been pressuring her to give him power of attorney over her inherited property for simplification purposes. We'd helped her understand exactly what she'd be giving up and how to protect herself instead. The work was satisfying in a way my previous business hadn't been. Instead of helping people organize their professional operations, I was helping them organize their personal lives to protect their autonomy and security. Every client who learned to recognize manipulation disguised as care, every woman who discovered she had more options than she'd realized, felt like a small victory against the kind of systematic exploitation I'd experienced myself. About a year after my transition, I was contacted by a journalist who was writing an article about financial elder abuse and domestic fraud. She'd found references to my case through public records and wanted to know if I'd be willing to discuss my experiences, obviously not knowing that she was actually talking to the supposedly deceased victim. I ended up providing background information as a family friend who'd witnessed the situation, helping her understand the psychological patterns that made such elaborate deceptions possible. The article, when it was published, focused on the increasing problem of spouses planning their partners' deaths for financial gain and the legal loopholes that made such schemes feasible. It mentioned Donald's case as an example of how financial desperation could lead to increasingly extreme betrayal, noting that he'd apparently been borrowing against his future inheritance for months before his wife's unexpected death left him not only without the expected windfall, but deeply in debt to creditors who'd believed his claims about his financial prospects. Reading about myself in the third person was surreal, but seeing my experience used to warn other women about similar dangers felt important. The journalist had quoted several experts about red flags to watch for. Spouses who suddenly wanted to simplify estate planning, unusual interest in life insurance policies, gradual removal of personal belongings from shared spaces, suspicious changes in routine medical care. All things I wish I'd recognized as warning signs before I'd overheard that phone conversation in the hospital hallway. The article also mentioned the importance of maintaining independent legal and financial advice. Something I'd been fortunate to have through Helen. Women who'd spent decades deferring to their husband's judgment often found it difficult to insist on their own representation when making major financial decisions, but that independence could literally be a matter of life and death when marriages became predatory. 2 years after my supposed death, James called to tell me that Donald had been arrested for insurance fraud in connection with a new girlfriend's suspicious accident. Apparently, he'd learned nothing from his experience with me and had attempted to repeat the same basic scheme with a woman he'd met at his retail job. This time, however, he'd been sloppy about the timing and the logistics, and the insurance company had become suspicious when he'd filed a claim within months of increasing the policy amount on a woman he'd only recently started dating. "He's looking at serious jail time," James told me. "The prosecutors are treating it as attempted murder for financial gain, and they're also investigating whether there might have been other similar cases. Your situation has been reopened as a potential homicide rather than a medical misadventure." That was ironic, considering that Cynthia Morrison really had died, in all the ways that mattered. The woman who'd accommodated and adapted and adjusted for 32 years was gone as completely as if she'd actually died in that operating room. Elizabeth Harper might have the same memories and the same fundamental personality, but she was a fundamentally different person, one who'd learned the difference between loving compromise and self-destruction. I'd been building a new relationship with someone I'd met through my consulting work, a retired teacher named David who'd contacted me for help organizing his finances after his wife's death. We'd started as professional acquaintances, then friends, then something more serious over the course of several months. What I appreciated about David was that he'd never known Cynthia Morrison, had never seen me in the role of accommodating wife, had only ever known Elizabeth Harper as an independent, decisive woman who owned her own business and made her own choices. David knew about my previous marriage, knew that I'd been widowed young, and had chosen to relocate for a fresh start. He didn't know the details about how that marriage had ended, and I saw no reason to burden our new relationship with the full story of Donald's betrayal and my elaborate response to it. Elizabeth Harper was a widow whose husband had died unexpectedly, leaving her to rebuild her life alone. That was true enough, in all the ways that mattered. We'd been talking about marriage, David and I, but I found myself hesitant in ways I hadn't expected. Not because I didn't trust him or love him, but because I discovered that I genuinely enjoyed being independently responsible for my own life. Elizabeth Harper's solitary routines, her ability to make decisions without consultation or compromise, her financial and emotional autonomy, these had become precious in ways I hadn't anticipated. "I don't want to be anyone's wife again," I told him one evening as we watched the sunset from my deck. "I want to be someone's partner, someone's companion, someone's equal. But I never want to be anyone's wife again." David was quiet for a moment, thinking, "What's the difference?" "A wife accommodates. A partner negotiates. A wife adapts to her husband's life. A partner builds a shared life. A wife assumes her husband's priorities are more important than her own. A partner assumes that both people's priorities matter equally. He nodded slowly. So you want to be partners who happen to live together, not husband and wife in the traditional sense. Exactly. I want to keep my own name, my own finances, my own space within whatever space we share. I want us to choose each other every day, not just assume we're stuck with each other because we signed papers once upon a time. David smiled. That sounds much healthier than what most people call marriage. And it was healthier, I realized. Elizabeth Harper's relationships were based on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than assigned roles, on genuine compatibility rather than social expectations. She'd learned to recognize the difference between love that enhanced her life and love that consumed it, between partnership that strengthened her and partnership that diminished her. The consulting business had grown beyond what I'd initially expected, largely through word-of-mouth referrals from women who'd discovered their own strength through the process of protecting their assets and autonomy. I'd started offering workshops on financial independence for women over 50, teaching practical skills like understanding investment accounts, recognizing manipulation in estate planning discussions, and maintaining separate legal representation even within marriage. The workshops were always full, with waiting lists that stretched months into the future. The demand told me something important about how many women were living variations of the life I'd escaped, accommodating themselves into invisibility while their partners made assumptions about their compliance and availability. Teaching these women to recognize their own power, to understand their legal rights, to trust their instincts about manipulation, it felt like the most important work I'd ever done. One afternoon, about 3 years after my transition, I received a call that brought my old life rushing back in unexpected ways. Helen Chen was calling to let me know that Donald had died in prison, apparently a heart attack brought on by the stress of his trial and incarceration. His second attempted murder case had resulted in a conviction, and the investigation into my supposed death had revealed enough evidence of planning and premeditation that he'd been facing additional charges when he died. There's no one to claim his body, Helen told me. He'd alienated what family he had, Diane had moved on completely, and he hadn't made any friends. In his new circumstances, technically as his widow, you would be responsible for burial arrangements, but since you're officially deceased, the state will handle it. The irony was complete. Donald had spent so much energy planning my death that he'd never considered his own mortality, never made arrangements for what would happen if his schemes failed and left him isolated and imprisoned. He'd die as alone as he'd tried to make me die, with no one to mourn him or remember him fondly. The man who'd been so confident in his ability to manipulate and control others had ended up completely powerless, dependent on the state's charity for even basic human dignity in death. I felt surprisingly little satisfaction in his demise. Elizabeth Harper had moved far enough beyond Cynthia Morrison's pain that Donald's fate felt more like a distant news story than personal justice. He'd made his choices, suffered the consequences, and now it was over. The chapter of my life that he'd dominated was closed completely, not through my action but through the natural progression of consequences he'd set in motion himself. What I felt instead was a kind of profound gratitude for the life I'd been able to build after escaping his plans for me. Elizabeth Harper's existence was proof that it was never too late to reclaim yourself, never too late to choose authenticity over accommodation, never too late to build relationships based on respect rather than exploitation. Every day I woke up in my coastal cottage, every client I helped discover her own strength, every evening I spent with David as an equal partner rather than a subordinate wife. All of it was a gift I'd given myself by refusing to accept Donald's definition of my worth and my future. The business continued to grow, and I eventually wrote a book about financial independence and personal autonomy for women in later life. I couldn't use my real story, obviously, but I could share the principles I'd learned and the strategies that had worked for other women in similar situations. The book became popular enough that I was invited to speak at conferences and workshops around the country, always as Elizabeth Harper, always focused on the future rather than dwelling on the past. During one of these speaking engagements, I met a woman named Patricia, whose story was so similar to my own that it was almost eerie. She was 59, had been married for 35 years to a man who'd gradually taken control of all their financial decisions, and had recently discovered that he'd been planning to have her declared mentally incompetent so he could gain access to her substantial inheritance. Unlike me, she'd confronted him directly, and he'd responded by having her temporarily committed for psychiatric evaluation, claiming she was having paranoid delusions about his intentions. The psychiatrist saw through it immediately, Patricia told me after my presentation. But the experience taught me that he was capable of much, more than I'd realized. If I hadn't had my own lawyer, if I hadn't documented everything carefully, he might have succeeded in having me declared incompetent permanently. Patricia had ultimately chosen divorce rather than disappearance, but she'd had to fight for every asset, every piece of property, every dollar she'd brought into the marriage. Her husband had contested everything, claiming that her mental health issues made her incapable of managing money, that he'd been protecting her from her own poor judgment for years. It had taken 2 years of litigation and substantial legal fees, but she'd eventually won complete financial independence and the right to control her own life. The hardest part, she said, wasn't the legal fight or even the financial losses. It was realizing that someone I'd loved and trusted for decades had been planning to have me institutionalized just to get access to money that was already legally mine. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it changed everything I thought I knew about human nature. I understood that feeling completely. The discovery that someone you've shared your life with has been systematically planning your destruction is a particular kind of trauma that goes beyond simple betrayal. It makes you question every memory, every moment of apparent affection, every decision you made based on trust and shared commitment. It forces you to reconstruct your entire understanding of your own life, separating genuine connection from elaborate manipulation. But what I'd learned, and what I tried to share with women like Patricia, was that surviving such complete betrayal could also be incredibly liberating. Once you've faced the worst that human manipulation has to offer and emerged intact, once you've discovered that you're stronger and more resourceful than anyone, including yourself, had realized, once you've built a life based entirely on your own choices and values, you become essentially unshakable. Nothing anyone could do to Elizabeth Harper could be worse than what Donald had planned for Cynthia Morrison, and since I'd not only survived but thrived, I knew I could handle whatever challenges came next. David and I did eventually formalize our partnership, though not through traditional marriage. We created a domestic partnership agreement that outlined our financial independence, our mutual responsibilities, and our commitment to maintaining our individual identities within our shared life. We bought a house together, but kept separate bedrooms and separate offices, shared common spaces but maintained private retreats. We combined some expenses but kept separate bank accounts, made major decisions together but reserved the right to make independent choices about our own lives and resources. It was, several friends told us, an unusual arrangement for people our age. Most couples in their 60s were either locked into decades-old patterns or trying to blend lives that had been separate for years after divorce or widowhood. But our deliberate, conscious partnership felt much more honest and sustainable than the traditional model of marriage that had nearly destroyed me. "We're proving that it's possible to love someone completely while remaining completely yourself," David said on our first partnership anniversary. "Most people think you have to choose between independence and intimacy, but we're showing that the best intimacy comes from choosing each other freely rather than being bound together by obligation." He was right. Elizabeth Harper's love for David was pure choice, uncomplicated by financial dependence or social expectations or fear of being alone. She loved him because he enhanced her life, respected her autonomy, and shared her values, not because she needed him to define her identity or provide her security. That kind of love was both stronger and more fragile than traditional marriage. Stronger because it was freely given and constantly renewed, more fragile because it could be freely withdrawn if circumstances changed. As I approached my 65th birthday, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. Cynthia Morrison had spent 32 years accommodating, adapting, and gradually disappearing into someone else's vision of what she would be. Elizabeth Harper had spent the last 5 years discovering who she actually was when freed from those constraints. The difference between the two women was so complete that it was hard to believe they were the same person. Cynthia had been afraid of conflict, afraid of disappointing people, afraid of being alone, afraid of making decisions that others might criticize. Elizabeth was comfortable with conflict when it served a purpose, willing to disappoint people whose expectations were unreasonable, genuinely enjoyed solitude, and made decisions based on her own judgment rather than other people's approval. Cynthia had measured her worth by how well she served others' needs. Elizabeth measured her worth by how authentically she lived her own values. The transformation hadn't been easy or instant. It had taken months of conscious effort to break habits of accommodation that had been reinforced for decades. It had taken practice to express preferences directly, rather than hinting and hoping others would guess what she wanted. It had taken courage to maintain boundaries even when doing so created temporary discomfort or disappointment for others. But the result was a life that felt genuinely worth living, relationships that enhanced rather than diminished her, and a sense of personal integrity that no external threat could undermine. I'd recently started mentoring younger women who were facing variations of the same challenges I'd experienced, helping them recognize manipulation disguised as love, teaching them to trust their instincts about their own safety and well-being, showing them that it was possible to build authentic relationships without sacrificing their essential selves. The work was deeply satisfying because it felt like passing on hard-won wisdom that could spare others some of the pain I'd experienced. One of my mentees was a woman in her 40s, whose husband had been gradually isolating her from friends and family, convincing her that people who questioned his behavior were just jealous of their happiness together. Another was a recent college graduate whose boyfriend had convinced her to put all her student loan money into investments he controlled, promising to pay for her education while building their shared future. A third was a woman in her 70s whose adult children were pressuring her to sell her house and move into assisted living so they could access her assets before she died. All of them were facing versions of the same fundamental challenge: how to maintain their autonomy and dignity in relationships with people who benefited from their compliance and dependence. All of them were struggling with the difference between love that supported their growth and love that required their diminishment. All of them needed to learn that choosing themselves wasn't selfish. It was essential for any relationship worth maintaining. The people who truly love you want you to be strong, independent, and capable of taking care of yourself, I told them repeatedly. Anyone who needs you to be weak, dependent, or controllable doesn't love you. They love having power over you. Learning to tell the difference will save your life, literally or figuratively. As Elizabeth Harper approached her 65th birthday, she was healthier, happier, and more financially secure than Cynthia Morrison had ever been. She had meaningful work, authentic relationships, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. She'd proven that it was never too late to choose yourself, never too late to recognize your own worth, never too late to build a life that reflected your authentic priorities and preferences. The woman who'd once lain in a hospital bed listening to her husband plan her murder was now helping other women escape their own versions of that trap. The woman who'd once accommodated herself into near invisibility was now teaching others to recognize and claim their own power. The woman who'd once been so afraid of conflict that she'd enabled her own exploitation was now comfortable with whatever discomfort was necessary to maintain her integrity and protect her well-being. Donald had thought he was planning my death, but what he'd actually done was force my rebirth. Cynthia Morrison had died in that operating room, not from surgical complications, but from the final recognition that the life she'd been living wasn't worth preserving. Elizabeth Harper had been born from the ashes of that realization, stronger and wiser and more authentically herself than the woman who'd preceded her had ever been, allowed to be. In the end, that was the most complete revenge I could have asked for. Not just surviving Donald's betrayal, but thriving beyond it in ways he'd never imagined possible. He'd thought he was destroying a weak, dependent woman who would be easy to eliminate and replace. Instead, he'd liberated a strong, independent woman who would go on to help dozens of others escape similar traps and build authentic lives of their own. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's becoming so completely yourself that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant, building a life so authentic and satisfying that their betrayal becomes just another step in your journey toward freedom. Donald had given me the greatest gift possible without meaning to. He'd shown me exactly who he really was, which allowed me to become exactly who I was always meant to be. Elizabeth Harper was living proof that it's never too late to choose yourself, never too late to recognize your own worth, and never too late to build a life that reflects your authentic priorities and values. And every day she woke up in her coastal cottage. Every client she helped discover her own strength. Every evening she spent with David as an equal partner. All of it was evidence that the best revenge is a life well lived, on your own terms, according to your own definition of success and happiness.